You'll recall Diache's rise in 2014, and a response to that was a global coalition against Diache was formed, and currently comprises 85 partners. If I get my maths right, it's about 76 or 77 nations and 7 or 8 other organizations such as the United Nations Advisory Mission Iraq, the ICRC, other NGOs that are out there, as an example. And there are 5 lines of effort. Maybe we'll come back to those later, but one is to stabilize the liberated areas. Another is to counter Daesh's propaganda. The third is to progress the military campaign. I'll come back to that in a moment. The fourth is preventing the movement of foreign terrorist fighters. And the fifth is to tackle Daesh's finance and deny Daesh their funding. So Operation Inherent Resolve is the military line of effort of that global coalition against Daesh. So I just wish to stress that the global coalition is about much more than just the military line of activity. But it was the military part of the overall coalition that I had the privilege of being the deputy commander of. And so it's an organization that is led by America, with 25 other nations as part of it, as well as the broader coalition that I described to you of 85 in total. It's deployed across the Middle East and working with partners in Iraq and Syria to tackle the residual Daesh threat that is there. I'm very happy to keep talking about it or answer specific questions, whatever you prefer.
Yeah, you just go into a little bit more detail. I think that'd be great in terms of. I'm actually quite interested to hear about this more more global coalition in terms of those 5 key objectives that we stated, especially in the current times. How, I don't know how much detail you can go into it about in terms of, yeah, just about those 5 initiatives. Could you just elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, sure. So you may, and your listeners may recall, Daesh's rise pretty rapidly, concentrated first and foremost on Iraq and Syria, but also, as we see today, in the Sahel in Africa, that there are Daesh offshoots there, Daesh offshoots in Southeast Asia, Daesh offshoots in Afghanistan. And so Daesh as a terrorist organization isn't just located in the Middle East. It is an idea attempting to radicalize principally young men and young women, not only in the areas that I've described, but also posing a threat, resulting in terrorism on the streets of Madrid, Naples, Paris, Nice rather, Paris, London, across the world. And so something that is not only a global threat, but also is funded through all sorts of different means and recruits from across the world requires very much a global response. It is not a military problem per se, it is a global problem. And so the global coalition against Daesh and those 5 lines of effort that I describe reflect that the global nature of the threat and therefore the global response that is necessary. What I must also stress, though, is it is an absolute fraction of the threat it was. But at the same time, we cannot be complacent, because many of the underlying factors that gave rise to Daesh in the first place still exist, in terms of poverty, marginalization, a lack of rule of law, lack of education, the impacts of climate change, for example, exacerbating the challenges that are there. The earthquake that struck southern Turkey and northern Syria, for example, killing tens of thousands, tragically, innocent people. Those are now more people and more families now that are struggling, that are vulnerable. So many of the vulnerabilities still exist there, but the coalition that I was the deputy commander of was addressing the military aspect of that.
And what would you say was the biggest challenge that your team had faced in the fight against the Islamic State or Daesh? And how have you been working, or how had you worked to overcome them?
Yeah, thanks, Anirudh. Just to make sure that your listeners are absolutely clear. So I've long since stopped being the Deputy Commanding General. So I had the privilege of deploying for a year, and I returned to the UK in November last year. So in a way, I'm out of date because things will have moved on. I maintain a considerable interest through the media, seeing what news reports come out, as well as hearing from colleagues that are there how things are tracking, and things are going very positively. I would say that, wouldn't I? But it's true, and it's a tremendous credit to our partner forces in Iraq and Syria, and a tremendous credit to the men and women that continue to work in partnership there. But to your question, Iraq and Syria are pretty large places. To employ some very British understatements, it's a pretty harsh terrain over long lines of communication, doing a really difficult job in a place that is complex terrain. It is also a volatile region. You will read as well as I the nature of the geopolitics and the nature of some of the violence that might occur within those two locations, those two countries, because of regional actors. And as I remarked, the geopolitical challenges are also exacerbated by environmental challenges. And I've commented already on the earthquakes as an example, but also the effects of global warming, meaning that there are fewer places that are able to be to offer a livelihood through agriculture, or indeed to feed the population. Water scarcity is an acute problem in Iraq and for the Iraqi population, for example. So this is a really, really difficult neighborhood. It's a tough region for the people that are living there, trying to pursue their dreams and carve out a future for their young people.
And so, if you don't mind, if we build on that geopolitical development in the region, in 2020 we saw the withdrawal of the US forces from Afghanistan. How did that affect the strategy and operations in Iraq and Syria?
Frankly, it galvanized the international community. It made clear to stakeholders, as I mentioned, the 85 partners committed to defeating Diache once and for all, in recognizing the significance of what was needing to be done, the tremendous sacrifice that had taken place concurrently for a number of years in Iraq and Syria to defeat Daesh territorially. That occurred in northeast Syria in Baghouz in March 2019. But having been galvanized, there was, certainly when I was deployed, and I'm very, very confident that there still remains now, a clear-eyed recognition that the job isn't done yet, and a clear-eyed determination of the global coalition against Daesh to make sure the job is done. Because there is Daesh, the brand, as I've described, that tries to propagate its propaganda, radicalized, vulnerable people, and recruit foot soldiers. There are detainees in northeast Syria. There are people in displaced persons camps, and there are small pockets of Daesh at large. And so these need to be addressed, and the international community was very much been galvanized towards that end objective along the 5 lines of operation I described to you. And I certainly witnessed firsthand the determination of political leaders that were visiting the region, and perhaps most critically political leaders from within the region, that this was a partnership through the global coalition, as well as the tactical operators, whether that's the Iraqi security forces, the Kurdish security forces, the Peshmerga, or it was the Autonomous Administration of Northeast Syria and the Syrian Democratic Forces, that were the people taking the fight to Daesh. The global coalition, led by America in the military line of effort, that is, were very much supporting and enabling. The leading was being done by partners on the ground. It was humbling and inspiring to witness, I have to say. I was very proud to serve with them.
So I think quite an interesting point to follow on from that is about partnerships, and I guess it kind of builds on from our earlier point surrounding connection. and the importance of connecting with people. So could you speak to the role that partnerships with local forces and other allies have played in the success? As you said, that they've been taking charge and taking real initiative in these operations. And how would you say that, in the more broad sense, when it comes to partnering with local forces and local people in different ways, not just within the army, as well as just globally when it comes to partnerships in general, how do you prioritize building those and then maintaining those relationships?
Well, first and foremost, and briefly though, because I think I've touched on it already, I wish to underline the immense bravery, commitment, and sacrifice of local forces that we've partnered with in Iraq and Syria. They have borne the brunt of the violence that Daesh has employed, and they've borne the brunt of the trauma that their nations and their peoples have had to deal with, and they continue to bear the brunt of that, but they do so with determination. So mutual respect, so a broader point, but also absolutely germane to what is happening and continuing the mission to defeat Daesh is mutual respect, a sense of partnership, but also more broadly, and this is something that the British Army is really determined to develop, is our cultural acumen, is our cultural understanding. So language is one thing, mannerisms, of course, are others, but also how different peoples, how different cultures view a set of circumstances, and from that, how they also, in partnership, how we recognize our respective strengths and weaknesses and how we can work in concert with one another to achieve the shared outcomes. Now that's a fairly generic description, but it is relevant. But to your question of how do you decide the priorities for the British Army and for the other armed forces, it starts with the policy that is set by the government of the day. And your readers, should they wish to learn more, I encourage them to read the integrated review. Online, readily available on the gov.uk site, and it's just received its refresh. So it was written in 2021. You'll recognise that things have moved on quite considerably in those last couple of years. So quite rightly had a refresh, fundamentally remained the same. But what it does is it identifies in big handfuls the broader geopolitical priorities for the UK to protect its values and its interests, to cultivate its partnerships, to identify partners and allies around the world. And it's then a duty for the armed forces to offer choices to the elected politicians of the day, and then for the armed forces to go and work with those partners and those allies dotted around the world on those shared objectives.
Cool. Wow. I think I'll definitely be reading the integrated review to learn more.
I've just downloaded it.
It's a good read. It's a good read. I might be biased, but it's a good read. I think the executive summary says plenty, and there's plenty in there for all tastes. And one thing that I'd also mention for your listeners' awareness that might not necessarily be that well appreciated is, in the past, it's fair to say that within the army we're quite tribal. You know, I'm a gunner by birth. Some people might be sappers, Royal Engineers. Others might be in the cavalry or the infantry, or working in human resources in the staff and personal support of the Adjutant Corps, for example, and a whole plethora of arms, corps and arms therein. So we can be quite tribal amongst ourselves, partly through pride, partly because we're quite competitive. The same is true between the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy, and the same is also true between the armed forces and those outside the armed forces. Something that has changed throughout my career is how joint operations, where the armed forces work very closely and very normally. You know, I'm very, very used to working with my Royal Navy and Royal Air Force colleagues and civil service colleagues, and love doing so in every operation I've deployed on, and a number of roles that I've done when not deployed on operations. But it has now gone wider in recognition that the security services and the intelligence services, Home Office, Foreign Office, as well as the armed forces, we're all part of the same team. And what you might find when you leaf through the integrated review, it will describe our national levers of power of diplomacy, information, military, and economic levers of power. No one of those can be pulled at any one point in time to achieve what the nation requires. All of them need to be pulled in concert with one another. And so the integrated review is very much, again, to our earlier conversation about being teammates, teamwork, the importance of that. The integrated review is a manifestation of teamwork across all of the government departments.
Perfect. And I think the final sort of question surrounding this, the present day is, we talk a lot about in terms of the future, in terms of unmanned aerial vehicles. So for those of you out there who have heard the just the brief names, so UAVs and other advanced technologies, they're becoming more widespread. So how do you see the future of military operations evolving in not just in the region, but in general, with the advancement of things like AI and technology in general?
Yeah, so the contemporary battlefield, and again, the integrated review is really good at bringing this to life, is perhaps in the past, just to really simplify. Oh, I don't know if there's a poltergeist in my room or my light bulb's about to go, but this is a podcast, so it shouldn't be a problem. The contemporary battlefields, whether that's overseas, the contemporary battlefield is neither home nor away. It is in both places now, because in this information age, you don't need to be competing just in the physical domain in the Middle East or wherever else, or Ukraine, for example. There is also a battle of narratives, a battle for influence that is happening online, in cyberspace, in the information domain. And the home and away have kind of blended. And sometimes there's physical force, but sometimes there's non-physical activities that can still have the effect on our populations and influencing political decisions and influencing national power. So it's become extremely complex, and the rate of this complexity and this evolution is arguably accelerating with the prevalence of artificial intelligence and big data. Now, I'm not an expert on these things, but what I recognize as a relatively senior leader in the armed forces is I need to become much more expert in it, because it's here now, and it is affecting how we operate it, and it will affect how we operate in the future. You touched on UAVs as perhaps one of many tactical changes, but I mentioned it briefly, but we should also bear in mind cyberspace and space, because these are other domains that are now materially having an effect on how nations will compete and how wars will be fought. And if you look at Ukraine as an example, with the provision of commercially available satellites to allow people to be able to navigate or see things, it's a very different place. So, we talk of there being 5 domains, others might say there are 6, but we've got land, we've got sea, we've got air, we've got space, and we've got cyberspace. The British Army, the armed forces, we need the best talent to be able to develop the methods of fighting in each of these domains at the same time, with change being ever present. So it's, the future is here, frankly, and the future is arriving at quite a pace.
I love that. In terms of, I think one of the big things, especially in our generation, Anirudh, is sometimes it's not just a battlefield out there of people. And I want to state, obviously, I'm not undermining what people do. It's also a battle of narrative. Who can get the narrative right? Who can influence the most people? And if that's one thing which I'm not necessarily looking forward to, but I think needs a lot of work in shaping, is the battle of narratives.
And I think data is very important. When you talked about cyberspace, I mean, data is more valuable than gold. They're the top 10 most valuable companies in the world. There are more data companies there than there are any other type of company. Tesla is a data company at the end of the day. And so I think that is a very important thing that everyone should be looking more into, not just the army, though the army should, if it is I think people in general should get greater interest in it, whether that be.
I mean, you touch on a broader point, Anirudh. In addition to the data, the salient data point that you make is that there is a I'm not going to abuse the maxim, but there's a truism that nations don't go to war or indeed preserve peace, or rather armies don't go to war or preserve peace. It's nations that do that. And nations sends their militaries to go and do what the nation requires. And it's politicians that issue the orders to do that. And it is the electorate that will appoint the politicians. And so it's very much a trinity between those three, between the political leadership, between the population, and between the armies. And whether a British citizen is serving within the army or not, it is really, really critically important that we have a shared understanding. We'll have differences of opinion. There'll be a spectrum of opinion, of course, but we have a shared understanding of what our nation stands for, that which we hold dear, our values, our way of life that we want to preserve, and a commitment to deploying and employing the armed forces and the army therein when it is necessary. So it's a constant conversation, not only to understand the nature of how warfare is evolving, but also what it is a nation requires its army to do, and what the army requires of its nation to be able to do it.
Thank you very much.
That's a great point to end on. Yeah, conversation. I think it's if any of you like most of you have listened to our podcast, you've listened since January 2022 when we started this. I think the one big thing we always hammer home is the art of conversation is one of the best mediums you can use to gain an understanding. There's not just reading, it's not just watching a video. If you can talk about it and you get challenged on your opinions, you challenge other people on their opinions, and you look at the facts and you analyze it and you talk about it. You disagree, fine, you disagree, but that shared conversation that really leads to a greater understanding. So as always, we implore you to conversate more. Just start random conversations in your friendship group. Yeah.
Yes. I think before we move into answering the inbox, I'd just like to thank Brigadier Harris, or Carl Harris, for talking extensively about the army, from why you joined, what the army currently does, and some of the key moments in your career. It's been a truly fascinating talk. You've given us some homework to do. We're now going to read the integrated review.
Yes,
but also, I think we enjoyed you speaking more than anything else. Before you joined the second Zoom call, me and Dylan were talking about how eloquently you spoke when using words like hubris, which we've only come across really in English literature. But also towards the end, you use the word maxim, which I saw put a smile on Dylan's face as we're both studying Kant. So thank you very much. And I'm sure many of our listeners out there will have lots of questions, but also be very pleased about what they heard today.
And just
my pleasure. Thank you very much. And as well as Immanuel Kant, I would, perhaps not quite so heavy, but the Centre for Army Leadership, I would also encourage as homework to just go and have a look around. I think whether one is interested in the armed forces, the army, or just leadership in general, I would really encourage anybody has a little bit of a look around there. Really great product that is applicable to all professions and vocations, and I think there's something there for everybody.
Yeah, and I think before we move on to answering the inbox, obviously in the podcast we'll have our links in the description, so you guys at home, make sure you check some of them out. I think I'm definitely going to be looking at a few things regarding Diache, in terms of I just want to brush up on my history for that. I also want to look at the integrated review, and I'm going to check out those leadership products that they have on offer. So obviously we'll reiterate that at the end of the podcast, but Anirudh, I think it's time we get into answering the inbox.